I want to start with a brief practice that I have found enables a sense of safety and embodied presence where you are. I believe it reassures our amygdala that we are not at risk and calms us and creates a feeling of comfort. Take some breaths, relax in your seat. With closed eyes, turn your head slowly side to side, crossing midline. Just to set up your orienting physical response. Slowly opening your eyes, then turn your head left very slowly, noticing the details, scanning what's around you and surrounds you. Left to middle to right, all your peripheral vision. Back to center. And now you know you're safe. Take a breath, stretch a little bit. Blessings on us and our bodies and to our sacred space today together. I honor the original peoples who lived thousands of years in balance and harmony, now called Coast Miwok, on the land where I live now in Marin County, California, which was the area of the Huimin tribelet in the village of Naike. It is said that this village was one of the first that moved into Mission Dolores when the conquistadors came to colonize and convert this land and its original peoples. My father's ancestors came over the oceans from Spain with Columbus and up to California with Junipero Serra, the founder of the Christian missions in California in 1769. So my family's been here now with my granddaughters living in San Francisco for 9 generations. These Spanish Catholics were instrumental in building the missions and colonizing the lands by battling the Indians, spreading decimating disease to them, imprisoning them in the missions, and setting up land grants of stolen land for non-native settlers. At one point, almost all of Northern California was titled to my Vallejo ancestors. The mission and rancho systems were enslavement systems that extorted labor and destroyed the culture, religion, and families of the California Indians, as well as the majority of those Indians who came into the missions. And when the Americans took over in 1850, Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, my grandmother's grandfather, my father's side, sponsored a law that launched an American genocide of California Indians for the next 20 years. My mother's ancestor came from Ireland, probably in 1820, and became an acclaimed general in the Civil War by massacring northwestern Shoshone in Utah in 1863. Mark Twain called him the best Indian killer in the West. This lineage is part of my identity and legacy, which I've been exploring for the past 20 years, and is my motivation to share Hilary's book and elicit your feelings and responses to her comprehensive and touching path, her path to truth and healing and repair. 6 years ago, I was able to send to Hilary and Basil Braveheart a prayer bundle of items recognizing my family perpetrations. Those bundles were burned, lifting my apology in prayer smoke to the universe. Thank you so much for reading and gathering and enjoying the special guests who've agreed to come to us. I have the hope that you might donate to their heartfelt projects. I invite you to introduce yourself with your name, your mother's name, where you were born, and where you live now, and its indigenous name, and introduce your cultural artifact. We'll be in small groups for about 8 minutes. Here we go. Yeah. So Lenny's my mentor on my path of accountability and recognition and atonement. Obviously, this is mostly a lot of my language. But Leny and I met at a Pioneers retreat, and she invited me into her multicultural classes. And 10 years ago, I videotaped an interview with her. And we're pretty sure she sent me the information about Basil Braveheart's forgiveness bundle ceremony. And Leny herself went to that ceremony in Santa Fe. And she said that her students, who are mostly white in our local Sonoma County here in California, do not often hear a story specifically from someone who is presenting it as a white ethno-autobiography. And at the first presentation, I don't know if you remember this, Leny, but I do, one of the first questions from a student to me was, have you forgiven your ancestors? And that represents to me the deep complexity of being in this exploration and was beyond my mind-heart capability at that time. But now with Leny and this time together, we can dive into themes like forgiveness and identity and healing, sacredness, shadow work, shame, and whatever arises for us within this luxurious time of 30 minutes, imagine. And afterwards, we'll have our small group again, and then 15 minutes of questions for Leny after that. So I think we're just going to have a freewheeling time here, Leny, like we usually do. But I wanted to start out with, how do you know Hilary, and why do you like her book and honor her work?
Yeah. Thank you, Molly, and thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. I'm greeting you and bringing the blessings of my ancestors from the Philippines, and the ancestors of the land where I am, on Wapo and Coast Miwok and Pomo lands. So I met Hilary at the first webinar that was organized by Bayo Acumulafe called We Will Dance with Mountains. I don't know if some of you have heard of Bayo Acumulafe. I brought Bayo Acumulafe to Sonoma State University before he got famous. Mm-hmm. So I met Hilary in that session, and then that was in 2017. And then in 2019, Hilary emailed me again and said, I think you might be ready or willing to write a letter of apology or forgiveness. And I said yes. And then she gave us instructions on to write this letter, wrap it in a red bundle, and then send it off to Basil Braveheart and the Sundance ceremony in New Mexico. And at that ceremony, later on, Basil Braveheart told all of the participants in that ceremony to go back to your communities and do this work. The same work of creating a ceremony of apology and forgiveness. So what I did when I came back, I contacted 2 allies from the Racial Justice Allies organization and asked them if they would co-facilitate with me, because I knew that I didn't want to do this work by myself. We contacted local indigenous elders and asked permission to do this work. And the indigenous elders said, when you do this work, or they said, do the work before you try to interface with the indigenous elders and indigenous community. Do your own work first. And don't ask indigenous peoples to tell you what to do. or to tell you how to do this work. Do your own work. So we came up with 3 questions. What does being a settler mean to you? And how did you get to come to this place, settle in this place?
Mhm.
And how does the history of native genocide impact your sense of self and identity?
Mm.
So we started meeting. This was during the pandemic, around early 2020s. We were able to start with a cohort of 15 people that we intentionally invited because we knew that they might be ready to do this work. And then we were meeting, I think, monthly or every 6 weeks, and we would have homework in between. We asked people to read The History of Native Genocide by Ben Madley, and there was another book by 2 local indigenous authors. We gave them homework on doing ancestral research into their own ancestral history, and that went on for a couple of years until 2022, when our indigenous elder who was with us in doing this work, Brenda Flies with Hawks, I think is in the audience.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Brenda, for your guidance. And she invited or asked us if we were ready to offer a public apology. And we did. We wrote a document signed by 33 people, asking for forgiveness and making a commitment to continue to do personal and communal or collective work of repair and healing and reparations. So that work is ongoing. It's still ongoing. And throughout this work, Hilary was our bridge to Elder Basil Braveheart.
Mm.
She has been the one that led us to Basil and introduced us. And every time we needed guidance, he would facilitate that. And so when she was writing this book, she started sending me parts of the manuscript and asking for comment,
Mm.
and that's how we have continued to do that. And I was so happy with the final result of this book.
Ah.
And in the review that I wrote about her book, I said that as a woman of color, as a woman academic who has been teaching about white privilege and whiteness studies, there are very, very few writers who have done the same kind of in-depth work that Hilary has done in this book. So I was willing to blurb it, I was willing to review it, and I was willing to tell everyone that this is a good book to study with,
Mm.
and for it to be a guide when somebody is willing and ready to do the kind of shadow work,
Ah.
or ethno-autobiographical work.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you want me to, do I have time to talk about ethno-autobiography
Yes,
as a
please.
framework for this? Okay.
Please.
So I was also working at that time in my classes with the ethno-autobiography framework. And this is an indigenous framework developed by Jürgen Kremer with the guidance of indigenous elders also. Yeah. And basically, the assumption is that all of us, including white people, all have indigenous roots.
Ah.
And then modernity and coloniality interrupted that process. And then what was recommended was that in order for us to return or recover our indigenous mind is to begin to consider our ancestral history, consider the history of the community, consider the work of community, consider the role of spirituality, consider the role of mythic stories and dreams. And so it's kind of a holistic framework of doing this work. And a lot of the work that needed to be done, I think, for white folks is the shadow work. And this
Mm,
is the bulk of the work that I did in my classes when I was still teaching. And it's something that is very challenging. But as you can see from Hilary's book, as you read it, um, when you kind of will yourself into facing the fear and facing the shame and facing the guilt and facing your own complicity and your own family history, that there will be a return of love, a return of reconciliation and forgiveness with your ancestors who were also traumatized by this history of civilization. So,
mm, mm.
in short, that's kind of
That's a lot packed in
yeah,
together.
yeah, yeah.
You touched on all the themes here that seem to be so provocative. As you know, your recommendation, how do we know when a settler or a white person is actually ready to do the work? What do you think is that movement in ourselves? And what do you think might be the cause for wanting to do the work as settlers? Mhm.
You know, looking at our story, our local story of how we put together these cohorts, we sent out the invitation to folks who were already doing racial justice work.
So racial
They were
justice.
part, yeah, they were
Mhm.
already interested in, being allies to Black Lives Matter. They were already interested in issues of environmental sustainability. They were already interested in, you know, progressive and liberal ideas of
Mhm.
what it means to be a settler, what it means to decolonize. So we knew that there was maybe a group of small folks, a small group of folks who might be ready to go a little deeper
Right.
into the shadow work itself. Because a lot of the liberal and progressive folks that were already doing activist work in these areas,
Mhm.
many of them really haven't done ancestral work
Yeah.
because that has always been a challenge. Many of them said, "Well, I don't know anything about my ancestors. Why do I need to know them? It doesn't have anything to do with the present."
Mhm.
So it and I think Hilary talks about that in her work, how she herself came to recognize that this is the work that she needed to do, and um, so I think of all of the elements of ethno-autobiography, it was the ancestral work that was
Mm.
the most challenging, most difficult, because people thought that they didn't have history.
Ah,
In my classes, the white students will always say, "I don't have history."
right. Right.
So
Because they're the
it is
normalized people.
because that is the story that we grew up with.
Mm.
We as a young country that's forward looking, that uh, and I think that's also part of the trauma, the denial
Ah.
and the lack of acknowledgement of
Mhm.
history.
Mm. Yeah.
And that's why when we do ancestral history, then we have to reckon with how our ancestors came to settle in this land.
Right.
What happened? What did they do to indigenous peoples?
Right.
What did they do to take the land, to take ownership of the land, and so on and so forth? And and to acknowledge that and to see the complicity in that takes a lot of courage,
Mm.
I think, to see it for
Yeah.
the trauma that it has caused, not just to Native Americans, but to their own heart and soul and
Right.
mind.
Yeah.
So that is, I think that's the beginning of the process of recognizing the need to do this work.
Mm.
It just begins with that small step of acknowledgement.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe they're right. Maybe when I listen to the history of genocide in California, maybe it does have something to do with me
Mm-hmm.
and my history.
Yeah.
Because I once attended a lecture on indigenous genocide in this part of the California
Mm-hmm.
by an indigenous elder. And I could just tell from the audience that they were not connecting with her story
Ah,
because they saw it as a historical event that didn't have anything to do with them,
right.
that didn't have anything to do with being white, that didn't
Yeah.
have anything. So I think when we begin to see how that version of history, the historical narrative that we
Right.
have been educated into, socialized
Mm-hmm.
into, has had to cover up or has to hide the shadow part of that history,
Right.
then that's the work that needs to be done.
Yeah. I want to say that some of my entry or gateway to this was a realization of the embodied toxins of the environment in which I grew up and in which I live right now. And then the realization that my body may be a toxic instrument of harm to my children, at minimum, in breastfeeding and birthing. And from there, I got to try to understand, well, where did I come from? Where and how do I embody what was completely inadvertent harms offered to the most precious people in my life? And then I realized, I was in my mother's body, in my grandmother's body. Um, and that's where I got to the lineage aspect of the complete relational, physical aspect of, yes, it matters where my grandmother grew up. It matters where she came from. And then understanding the epigenetics. So I'm resonating with the ancestral story that you're saying is how powerful it is to see and understand that we are made of the histories. And so therefore it's not gone, it is us in a way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so the potency of then relating to where we are. And I think that, I want to bring up that it seems very heartbreaking to learn this history and grievous. And when you brought it up just now, I could feel my body reacting to, yeah, I've learned this. I'm learning this in detail. And I am grief stricken by the horrors that were perpetrated and likely in my name. So, what do you think about this pain and grief that we have when we realize bad things and when we realize that we're a part of it? And then, of course, we're still embedded in the society that's still manifesting this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we always talk about this day, at least what I'm hearing more and more of is the need to do this work in community.
Mm,
You cannot do this grief work, shadow work by yourself.
okay. Thank you.
That we need to do this in community. So that was the first thing that I did when Basil Braveheart gave us that mandate,
Mm-hmm.
is for me to look for people who will walk this path with me, and even after we made the apology, even after we decided that we will not continue meeting regularly, we still made a commitment to get together as often as we want, to eat together, to invite each other and share a meal and do projects, support indigenous elders, and we're still doing that.
Wonderful.
We're
Yeah.
still doing that because you can never. I think it's really grief. This grief that we carry is
Mm,
not just personal grief. it's historical, it's collective, it's communal, and
Yeah.
and I'm reminded of Martin Pretel, this indigenous elder who wrote that all the wars that we are fighting is just unprocessed grief,
Oh, wow. Mm,
you know. And
bummer.
I think the big part that um, this processing of grief did in Hilary's book is what made this work really powerful, no?
Yes.
Um, by looking at the trauma, by looking at her complicity, by looking at her family's history, and then by paying attention to her dreams, by doing research on her ancestry in Scotland and Ireland, and then the ancestors who owned slaves in this continent, and then she went on to pay attention to the dreams that were coming to her as she
Mm,
was beginning to learn and embody what it means to recover an indigenous mind, an
mm,
indigenous heart.
hmm.
So, um, and I think the other beautiful thing that I really like about this work is how she acknowledges all of the people, all of the non-human beings,
Mm,
all the books, and all of the resources that came to help her write this book.
yeah, yeah.
That this is not just my book. This is the result of interpersonal philanthropy, as she would call it.
That's it,
Yeah,
it's a
yeah,
beautiful
yeah, yeah,
orientation, and she
yeah,
it's
yeah.
chock full of so much to help us learn more
Mm-hmm,
and understand. So,
mm-hmm.
um, what about forgiveness and healing? And who feels capable of being forgiven? And sometimes I deeply grapple with the worthiness of am I worthy actually of being forgiven? Do I forgive my ancestors? And and is that tied into my healing, let's say, or the healing of the world? And I just want to make sure that, the restoration of our Mother Earth that we've been destroying in such a way is I believe a part of the healing
Mm-hmm.
that is being
Mm-hmm.
called for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that is forgiveness is one of the concepts that we spent a lot of time trying to see if we wanted it in the title of what to call our group.
Oh,
At first, it was because Basil's ceremony was called Ceremony of Apology and Forgiveness. And then we said, well, we don't know. Forgiveness is a Christian concept, or maybe. And so we went back and forth on what it means to forgive. And then we invited Elder Basil Braveheart to speak to our group. And, and Basil spoke specifically about forgiveness as radical self forgiveness, that we need
mm,
to forgive ourselves before we ask forgiveness from people that we have wronged, before we ask forgiveness for anything else that have happened in our life. We need to recognize and forgive ourselves first. And then he went on to talk about what has happened to him as a Lakota person,
mm,
and how he was taken away to boarding school, how he escaped boarding school, how
mhm,
he went to Vietnam, how he became an alcoholic, how he destroyed a lot of marriages, and so on and so forth, until the community and the elders in that community said, you need to do ceremony so you can forgive yourself.
mm,
And and I have been in several ceremonies, indigenous ceremonies, where the elders would say, so many things have been done to our bodies. They have been abused. We have been raped. We have been stolen and disappeared and so on. He said, but remember that there is nothing they can do to your body because you are made of stardust. Because you're made of stardust. So that was L. Frank. And I will always remember that, and even me when I have to deal with my own self doubt and my own feeling of being unworthy and or feeling not being good enough,
Mm.
not being enough, is to always remember the grandmother of Basil Braveheart, who didn't learn English but taught him how to sing songs, taught him the lessons from the stars, and taught him the creation stories. And so we begin to get to know the place that holds us.
Mm.
I think for me, that has been my work the last couple of years, is just developing this relationship with the land where that has held me for 40 years,
Yes.
which I didn't do until maybe a decade ago,
Mm-hmm.
and those little practices, and Hilary refers to these practices that you can do to begin to get to know the earth, to get to know the land, to get to
Yes.
know the place, the history of the place
Right.
and the beings that live here, and then having a relationship with the non-human beings,
Mm.
And I know I was telling Greg Series the other day how I go around hugging trees at Spring Lake, and he says, "How do you know that the trees want to be hugged?" So anyway,
Uh,
um, but that has been one of the gifts,
mhm.
is for me, has been reading and learning about the history of the Pomo people and the Coast Miwok
Mhm.
and the Wapo people of this area, this particular area, because the land will teach you. And that is the big lesson from Hilary's book, is that the land will teach you because the land can hear you.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
and I love what you say about you must fall in love with the
Mm,
land, fall in love, uh,
mm,
and and uh, and so how does that obviously a sense of reverence and
mm,
is what I grapple and hold to at this point, but that falling in love in relationship with where I am and what is reality and who are my primal ancestors, which are the
mm,
other than human beings.
mm,
And,
mm,
and sometimes I think, okay, I'm changing my origin story to go all the way back to that stardust that you mentioned. That if
mm,
that if we're all made of the same matter, can't we understand we're related and then we will love each other?
mm.
Mm.
Well, one time, uh, a shaman gave me instructions to do ceremony on Sonoma Mountain.
Oh.
And he told me to bring, offerings to the mountain. And then when I started driving around to see where I could park, I couldn't find parking because the entire mountain is fenced and privately owned. There was no place to park and there's no trespassing signs all over. And I thought, because the instruction was, Lenny, he says, make your offering, lie on the ground, and wait for the dragon to appear. So, so while we were driving around looking for space, I just got angrier and angrier because I said, look at what we have done to this mountain.
Mm.
It has been privatized, it has been fenced off so that only wealthy people can live here and can afford to live here.
Mm.
And there's no place to park and so on. So I thought maybe that was the dragon
Um,
rearing its head and telling me that this is not okay. I mean, those little incidents that come to us or are given to us as gifts. One
mhm.
time I was just walking by the creek and I stopped and I said, why haven't I talked to you all these years? I've lived here for 30 years and I've never introduced myself to you, and I'm doing this now. And then I just sat there and cried,
Mm,
you know,
yes.
or this giant redwood tree behind my house. And I said, why haven't I seen you before? So to begin to notice those things, I think came with my decision to slow down.
Mm,
I deliberately said, I will no longer organize conferences. I will no longer write books. I will no longer say, do this and do that. All these things about being ambitious and being productive and being, you know, a good, successful member of society. I said, I'm, I'm just going to be here and develop a relationship.
ah,
Develop relationship. Because one time I was with a Pomo woman, we were sitting around, and the other white women that were with me, they were talking about the vacations they have taken in Europe. They do this, they do that. And then this woman, the Pomo woman, said, I haven't been to many places, but I know this place like the back of my hand.
mm, ah,
And she knew the name of all the trees and all the beings that live in one of the parks where we were walking. So that really touched me when she
yes.
said that. I know this place like the back of my hand.
Oh,
How many of us can say that?
it's so
You
moving.
know? Yeah. So it's that kind of falling in love.
Mm,
How do we fall in love with the land? When I was teaching, one of the first incident, one of the homework that I gave to my students
mm,
was sit by a tree or sit on a rock, and then wait for this being to tell you something. And of course, they were complaining, oh, this is so silly. This homework is so silly. And then this one girl said that she was sitting in her bedroom, and then she looked out and there was a tree. And then the tree, she realized, was giving her shade from the hot summer sun.
mm.
And then she went on to write a thank you to this tree. And then she went to class and read this very beautiful love poem to this tree. You see,
Oh,
I think that kind of deep listening
mm,
and attention, that we pay attention, evokes the most beautiful gesture of love making, you know, to another being. Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
That
yeah,
that is
yeah.
so touching. And I feel the yearning that I
Mhm,
want that. A
mhm,
deep, deeply felt desire.
mhm,
I want to be
mhm,
in love. I
mhm,
want to be loving. And I know uh, that that is possible, it
mhm.
seems, in your
Yeah,
experience, in your offering, in
yeah,
your mentorship for
yeah.
us, Leny. Thank you for
Mhm,
saying that and for
mhm,
being with us in this yearning.
yeah.
Makes me very touching. Thank you. I hate to end because I feel the invocation. I feel the blessing of of the love that we want, the love that we want to be. Thank you. So I'm going to invite all our wonderful relatives here with us today to also be able to talk with other people. This feels very intimate and a good idea for us to be able to talk with someone else about it. And then we'll come back and talk with Leny. Ooh, welcome back, everyone. Such a touching, I had to just shed a few tears in the small room uh, about the love and the beauty of what Leny Strobel is offering us. And it's deeply touching and beautiful and full of love. So I invite questions that you may have directly for Leny, and I would ask you to click the raise hand icon, should be down in the bottom nav bar, and just click that, and then and that you stay within 30 to 60 seconds of your question, so we have time to share and listen to Leny. So let's stay with short question but pungent. Questions, comments then? Kurt. Oh, wait a minute. I'm trying to unmute you. Unmute yourself. Yeah. There we go.
Thank you, Molly, for doing this. Lenny, so I'm making some assumptions. I may be wrong, but my assumptions are you said Philippines. I thought you emigrated from the Philippines here. It, and if that's the case, my question is around my relatives all came to the United States like in the early 1900s. And yet I still feel like they took advantage of the colonization of the land that had been done before them. And I'm just wondering if you could you share something about what your part of that story is, if that's a true thing. I mean, I may be making an assumption, and sorry if it's
Yeah.
wrong.
Well, it's true. I came as a 30-year-old immigrant in 1982. So, and I've lived in the same house for 42 years now. And not too long ago, I changed that immigrant to settler because I really came to understand that the notion of immigration was still a colonial construct, you know. But the definition of what it means to be a settler in this on Turtle Island resonated with me and felt more true to my experience. And and I struggled with that. And I've tried to ask some indigenous elders. I said, is it okay for me to claim that I belong here? And then, Greg Seri said, as long as you fall in love with this land, you will belong here and you will be part of a moving history. You will be part of a moving history forward. So um, I feel that part of the responsibility of being a guest on these lands is to learn everything I can about the history, about even my own history as a Filipina, where my own ancestral roots also have colonized other indigenous peoples in the Philippines. So uh, the history connects me and my home connects my settler identity in this country to my homeland identity in the Philippines, because the civilizational process, the process of colonialism and empire building, um, that was already what was making or creating the modern world. So it's all connected. Yeah. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
I think it
You're
hits.
muted, Kurt.
Yeah, I'm still muted. Yeah, no, no, thank you. That's right down the road, down the path where I was wondering and thinking and feeling myself. Yeah, because I feel the connection to my tribal roots in Germany,
Mm.
pre pre nation state, right? Oh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and, and yet and yet, okay.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. That's really
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to jump in. I can't find the hand raise spot on here for some reason, but Lenny, I'm wondering, you mentioned that your people were colonized other people on the Philippines. My question was, I mean, the Philippines is a place that has experienced colonization from several different nations, and I was wondering how that informs the process that you're going through now, uh, as you've immigrated here to the US.
Um, when I say my people, the Kapampangans, were also colonizers because they were actually settlers that came from outside of the Philippines. And when they arrived to this area where my people are, there were already indigenous peoples there. They're called the Aitas. And the Aitas are now kind of marginalized and, you know, oppressed like all other indigenous peoples are. So um, the way I have dealt with the question of what is the question again, Andy? I lost my
I
train
was
of thought.
just wondering how, I mean, it seemed like, and maybe that was an assumption that was wrong, but that that your family history experienced both being colonizers and being
Mm,
colonized,
yeah,
and
yeah,
how that
well,
informed, your
yeah,
process here in
yeah,
the US.
yeah. Well, in fact, in my letter of apology and forgiveness, I said that I said I apologize for my ignorance of Native history, in the history of genocide. I apologize for my miseducation. I apologize for, all the things that I didn't learn in school, you know. Um, and then I offered forgiveness. I said I offer forgiveness to my colonizers, the Spanish, the British, the Americans, and I'm learning. That is still in process. Just learning to forgive that because I knew that 500 years, not so, yeah, 500 years of colonial history in the Philippines was what mostly shaped my consciousness. So when I go back to my pre-colonial, my indigenous consciousness, I have to go back 5,000 years or older, you know, to find that.
Uh,
Yeah,
mm.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you. That's
Lenny.
helpful.
Mhm.
Yeah. I see Liz Mary. Liz, probably your mother's name is Mary, huh?
Mary Jo.
Mary
Yeah.
Jo.
Yeah. I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to really say thank you, Lenny, for being here and for your leadership through the cohorts and bringing Basil Braveheart into Sonoma County. And also really wish that I had been able to be a student of yours at Sonoma State. So just, heartfelt thank you. And also to you, Molly, for bringing this, study or this looking at this wonderful book to us and offering this to us. So thank you.
You're so very welcome. Thank you. Gratitude we accept at all times.
Thank you, Liz. I love Liz. You know, yeah.
Karen. Yeah.
Mm. Well, Lenny, my whole body resonated with so much of what you gave to us tonight. And there was one statement that you made that I have known in my heart is true, but I wonder if you've had some pushback around it. And it was the statement that I think you were quoting Basil Braveheart when you said that you need to start with forgiving yourself. And once you forgive yourself, then you are ready to ask for forgiveness from those who have been wronged by virtue of your white privilege or whatever. And I've known that to be true, and I've actually raised it in a couple of circumstances where Indigenous people have been around, and I've gotten some pushback on that statement. The statement that I've heard is, it's not really your place to forgive yourself. You need to come to us to ask for forgiveness. So I would just like to pose that as a bit of a challenge, and see what has been your experience around making that statement.
When we were starting the cohort work and trying to decide to use the word forgiveness, there was an indigenous woman who said, don't come to us for forgiveness until you have worked on forgiving yourself.
I love it.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes I think it depends on our relationship with indigenous groups, indigenous folks, whether or not they can trust what we are saying. So if you come to them saying, please forgive me, but if they didn't have any basis for offering forgiveness because there was no relationship that has been established yet, then that is something that needs some work. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's all about
Yeah.
relationship, isn't it?
Yeah.
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 Thank you, Leny. And then we have one other, Diana, would you like to ask? And then, yeah, let's see what you'd like to say, Diana.
Well, I have two questions. The way that you said you can belong here when you fall in love with the land. I think that statement is particular to people, you and people like you who have done the work. I don't think it's a one and done, because I'm just saying that because I know a lot of people here who are in love with the land, know the land intimately, feel their roots down the land, have been here generations, and yet they are on the other side of the work in terms of they don't want to acknowledge any sort of history that would put their own side on the bad light. So I just want to say it's not only about your relationship with the land, it's also about the inner work, is how I would interpret the statement.
You're right. And that's part of what we had tried to emphasize in the cohort work that we were doing locally, because some of the folks in our group were already environmentally conscious and were environmental activists. They were, they knew the language of loving the earth and loving the land. But when it came to, let's look at your ancestral history, let's look at the shadow of the history you brought with you, and it was so hard for folks to go there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just part of the way we white folks have been conditioned how to think about themselves. If you are not taught how to connect with your ancestors, then of course you don't know how. Then you'll have to find a way to begin. So yeah.
If I could ask a second question, unless I'm interrupting.
Yeah, go ahead. Final one.
So doing the work in community, I feel a little bit, I'm online in a community doing this kind of work a lot, but I would love to try to reach out locally to have an in-person group specific to our community and our land. And I'm not sure how I, not being affiliated with any particular group or university, I'm just a person in the world doing this work, how I might go about organizing something or reaching out to see where the interest is, or if I have the authority to convene a group and attempt to put it together. I don't know.
Well, you don't, I think you don't need a professional identity or some credentials to do this work. Do you have one or two friends with whom you can have a conversation about this? And if you start with that, this, if I invite a couple of friends and say, this is really close to my heart, and I would like to find people who want to talk about it with me, then that's how you start. And that's why I called one or two folks and that I already knew, because we had been doing work in racial justice for a couple of years, and I said, I don't want to do this alone. Would you do this with me? And they said, yeah. So just ask, and then if you want to do the kind of work, then feel free to contact me as a resource person. I'll share the resources that we have used, and there are so many online resources too. So you're not alone, And Molly is here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Leny, for saying
Yeah.
that. And I'll just
Yeah.
say, at one point, actually, it was last fall, I decided, okay, I think I need to pull together people and talk about this. And I went to my networks, and 30 people came, and I called it Decolonizing Our Hearts. And now there are 5 of us who get together every month. And I could name for you who's on this screen in that group. And I had agendas when we first started, and then now we just get on there, and wow, do we need to talk to each other about what we're doing and what's happening in our lives, and what's going on in our lives. What is going on in our lives? And it's deeply beautiful to have deep conversations with people who want to. So it feels like a wonderful environment for all of us. And Leny, at one point we talked about you giving us a blessing and a send off, a prayer and blessing for us at the end. And we are at the last 2 minutes. Do you want to do something like that, Leny?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, our ancestors, for listening in on this conversation. May you open the hearts and minds and soul of those who have been here to listen to what was shared. Thank you for the book of Hilary Giovale. Thank you for the work that she has done to bring this work to us and to many others that will receive it and read it. We are part of a global movement to begin to turn our gaze upon the most important work that we could do to make things right again, to repair the trauma of history on Turtle Island, and to connect us to our much older history of rootedness in our homelands where our own ancestors come from. May this earth may we feel the love of this earth coming back to us as we made this offering of love and gratitude to her. We thank you for your presence, and we bless you and send you off with peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Amen. With beauty and deep bows to all of us, and tears that are cleansing and purifying, and from our bodies and from our hearts. Our thanks to Leny, our guide and our mentor. May we invoke your prayer in our lives and your guidance in our path. Amen.